Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on building a grassroots strategy. This webinar is part of our 2013 monthly nonprofit advocacy webinar series. My name is Mark Buenaflor from the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of items. First, you should see a slide on your computer screen with the title of today's webinar. If you don't, or if you have any problems during the webinar, please dial Start Meeting's toll-free support line directly for assistance. The number is 800-644-9070. Again, that number is 800-644-9070. That number is also listed in the instructional email that was sent to you yesterday. In order to ensure good sound quality and eliminate background noise, we have muted the phone lines. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. However, we do want you to ask questions. The way to do that is by using the chat box on the right side of your screen. You can choose to have your question seen by just the presenter or by all participants by selecting which recipient gets the message. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat box at any point during the webinar. We'll also set aside some time at the end for questions. After today, we'll send a follow-up email with a link to watch the webinar recording on our YouTube channel. Next month, our topic will be working with your board to develop a policy plan, and in October, we'll take a look at fundraising for advocacy. Please register online for any of these free sessions. And now let me turn things over to MCN's Public Policy Director, Susie Brown.
Good morning, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. For those of you who are new to the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, we support individual nonprofits and Minnesota's nonprofit sector to be their own voice in the public policy process. We provide training on advocacy and lobbying and serve as a resource to policymakers on the nonprofit sector, advocating on issues that impact all nonprofits, such as incentives for charitable giving, nonprofit tax exemptions, lobbying rights, and others. Today's topic is building a grassroots strategy. We know that all of you who have joined us today recognize that building a grassroots strategy is an important tool. Of course, that's why you've joined us. But I'll take just a minute to review why this is such a critical approach for nonprofits. In our sector, people are our greatest assets. We also know that we know many things about the community that the community knows that will make their lives better. We also know that policymakers respond to people who are organized, and a well-planned strategy will help you achieve your goals. So we look forward to your joining us today in this training. We're delighted that Dana Montgomery from Grassroots Solutions has joined us to be the presenter today. Dana is a senior project manager at Grassroots Solutions, where she manages grassroots advocacy and organizing projects for clients such as Minnesota Public Radio, Tobacco Free Missouri, Transit for Livable Communities, the Bush Foundation, Health Partners, and many others. She frequently designs and facilitates trainings and workshops and loves the opportunity to teach others skills related to grassroots organizing. Dana got her start in advocacy at the University of Wisconsin and followed that with work at the Minnesota Community Action Partnership before joining Grassroots Solutions in 2005. Thank you, Dana, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Susie. Susie told me that she was going to mention that I was at the State Fair with our staff on Friday, which we do every year, and I'm proud to say that me and my colleague, B. Rongich, got the fair hair, which some of you may be familiar with, where they put glitter and hairspray in your hair, and I kind of look like a crazy person, but if that gives you any sense of who I am and my willingness to make a fool of myself, you know, that's a good thing. So thank you for that introduction, Susie. As she mentioned, I'm a senior project manager at Grassroots Solutions. I've been there about 8 years now, and I do come from the nonprofit sector. That's where I got my cut my teeth, as it were. So what do we do at Grassroots Solutions? I want to talk just a little bit about that before we jump into the meat. So we are founded on this idea that people matter. So what does that mean? It means that, we believe strongly that people have a stake in shaping the issues and policies that affect their lives and that affect their communities. So what we do in a nutshell is work with nonprofits, associations, government entities, and, foundations, some of the folks that, Susie mentioned, on, getting people involved in issues that they care about through engagement, advocacy, and organizing efforts. So this could be about a very specific issue or policy. So how do we get movement on this issue by X period of time, utilizing people and leveraging the communications and lobbying resources at hand. It could be about, engagement a little bit more generally. So, say an organization has a lot of people in their network or in their access, and they want to figure out how do we leverage them more systematically and strategically over time so that they stay involved and engaged and help us achieve their goals. And a lot of this really is rooted in strategic and effective planning. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, how to think of strategies that are clear and smart and really help organizations get where they want to go. And then lastly, I'll just say that we also do electoral / campaign work, in other words, so stuff that happens at the ballot box. So, field campaigns on behalf of candidates or referendum campaigns, things like that. And we also do evaluation around advocacy funded efforts and things of that nature. So that's a little bit about us. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today. We don't have a ton of time. There was a few key things that we wanted to focus on, through that frame, through that lens of engaging and organizing people in issues. So we want to talk a little bit about the importance of and differences between setting goals, strategies, and tactics that engage people, understanding the value of and how to think and just plan more strategically in your advocacy and engagement work. And then here's some tips for avoiding common pitfalls. And then the last thing on this slide here, which is less of an objective and more of just, a thing to note about this presentation, we really wanted to aim towards appealing to a broad audience. Like, we recognize there's a lot of different organizations, who are joining this call today, and that, some of you have varying capacities and roles in your organization, and some of you have varying degrees of familiarity with these, with this subject matter. So we're going to keep it fairly broad. We're going to cover some of the basics, but then hopefully, give folks some new meat to chew on too, and just provide a high-level overview, and then leave some time at the end for specific questions if folks have them. And speaking of questions, good reminder that, as Mark had mentioned, if you have questions throughout, please don't hesitate to enter them in the chat box, or, of course, observations or just things that struck you too would be great. All right, so let's talk about a few definitions to make sure that we're on kind of the same page moving forward. And these are, definitions that we use, and they may be slightly different than how you use these terms, but just again to kind of to make sure that we're on the same page. Grassroots, we're talking about a ground up, a very specific approach to organizing that really engages everyday people, not political pros, in issues that impact them and their community. And then organizing. So people often use organizing and mobilizing interchangeably, and I want to draw this distinction because organizing is really about building power over time. So recruiting, educating, engaging, preparing supporters so that when it's time to activate them, or as we like to call it, mobilize them, they are ready, they're amped up, they have what they need to do that, and then you'll get a better return on your investment if they are organized in advance of that work. And then advocacy. To me, this is really about encouraging people, usually more than one, right, a group of people, to take action together in support of an issue or cause. So let's talk a little bit about some of the assets and challenges that, I have seen both in my work in the nonprofit sector and then my work working on behalf of nonprofits in this current capacity when it comes to, engaging people in grassroots organizing in their networks. So one of the things that's really amazing about nonprofits is that you guys have compelling issues that resonate with the public. And that may seem really obvious, but you cannot organize people in an intentional way if you don't have an issue that's compelling or engaging to them. So that's huge. You guys have deep knowledge of the issues and the impact. So you have a history of this work. You understand how this impacts people in their lives. You often, I know not always, have the capacity to leverage people in the form of members, volunteers, or partners. And this is important in two ways, I think. One, in that you were able to activate people to take action on something that you care about. But then also, these are people and networks that can be used to add capacity to the existing, staff infrastructure that you have. And then you guys have personal stories from those that are directly affected, right? So it's not enough to just throw out data and numbers and information that speaks to people in their mind, in their head. You need the heart stuff too. And those are the personal stories that really resonate with elected officials and the public and people who care about your issues and who can help to build sort of momentum to move them forward. And then lastly, a history of work to learn from. So you guys have been doing this for a long time, either yourselves personally or your organization. So you know stuff that's worked in the past, stuff that hasn't worked in the past, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time, and that's a huge asset. So what about some of the challenges that we've seen? So the first bullet on here is going to be a big duh, I'm sure. You guys know you're dealing with limited resources. Sometimes advocacy, from my experience, it's not always the thing that's at the top of the list because you guys have a lot of other stuff going on. So it's often the thing that gets the short end of the stick. I think taking on a lot, again, this is not going to be surprising. You guys are doing work out there that, a lot of other people aren't doing on behalf of your issue. So I think sometimes there's a feeling of if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it. So then what happens is that there's a need to take on everything and do a little bit of everything instead of focusing on a few things more intensely. And then I think these last two things are connected. So focusing exclusively on a set of tactics that aren't tied to a common goal. So maybe, there really wasn't time. You're in what we kind of like to call, reactive mode versus preactive mode. So there isn't a lot of time to do a lot of, clear goal setting. So you're focusing on a lot of activities, but they're not actually tied to something that's moving your work forward. And then the other piece is maybe that you have a goal that you've established, but once you get into the thick of things, things start coming at you and you are focusing on activities that maybe don't help to achieve those goals, or maybe you're just taking on way more activities than you can handle. So we're going to talk then today about how to mitigate some of those challenges and leverage those assets and resources for success by, talking about, what are clear goal strategies and tactics, because we really believe from our experience doing this work and by advising nonprofits and frankly businesses and other, different kinds of entities, that this is just the most important first step in creating a clear course of action. And then secondly, once you have those goal strategies and tactics, how do you map it out? Build a plan that, is really ensuring that you're leveraging those unique assets and also helping to mitigate those challenges while remaining realistic and focused over time. So let's talk about creating a grassroots strategy. So some of this stuff may be obvious to many of you on the phone, but it just felt really important, again, to be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about creating clear goals, strategies, and tactics. So what do we mean by a goal? So the goal is, dun, 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 the outcome, right? What do you want to achieve or accomplish within a certain time frame? So while that may seem obvious, I think there's a few places in which it's easy to get tripped up, right? So for one, this needs to be really measurable, realistic, and doable. So it doesn't matter what you have on paper. It doesn't matter what you've mapped out on a whiteboard in a brainstorming session with your staff or your partners. If it is not measurable, if it is not realistic, if it's not something that your organization can do, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. So it's really, really important to be clear about what is tangible and what is doable. I think the second thing is being aware of conflating, aspirational / kind of mission statements with goals. So we want to eliminate hunger. Might be your mission or aspirational statement as an organization, and we're going to use this example, actually, hunger, throughout this presentation. But, it has to be it has to be measurable, and you have to focus on an attainable goal that builds towards achieving that end. So yes, your mission is that you want to eliminate hunger, but what are the things that you can focus on the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years that work to achieve that end? So maybe it's advancing X hunger policy, or getting, a certain amount of money appropriated in the bonding bill that'll go towards a program that will help to reduce the number of people who are living with hunger every day. Or maybe it's creating a food shelf in your local community within the next couple of years, because you know that there's a high rate of people, with the downturn in the economy, who are dealing with hunger issues, and there really isn't a resource for them there. So let's talk a little bit about strategies and tactics then. So strategies, these are what we like to call the broad approaches that you will take to accomplish your goal. So let's say that you have decided you want to build or create a food shelf in your community. A broad approach of how you're going to move that forward is you probably got to create public awareness around the need for a food shelf first, right? Or if policy related, maybe it's, we have to educate elected officials about hunger issues in our community. We have to figure out who is a player in this, who we have to talk to, where they are on the issue, how do we move them, right? So those are strategies that you're going to lay out that are going to help you, that kind of help frame up that goal and help you figure out and begin to start laying out a pathway. The tactics, right? These are the things, this is the place where most of us live, because this is the fun stuff. This is the stuff that we get to do every day that helps us move our issue forward and really help us measure our progress, right? So tactics are the tools and activities that you will use to drive your strategies. So for example, if you want to create public awareness around the need for a food shelf, a tactic might be holding a teletown hall, inviting members in the community to engage in conversation about hunger increase, right? Or if it's policy related, we have to ID and recruit a certain number of people in our network to have conversations with their elected officials. So all of this is really nice and easy, and a lot of you are probably nodding your head, right? You probably do a lot of this work already. But I think the challenge is once people get started, it's difficult to stay on task. So let's talk a little bit about, and this is present company included here, by the way. I think this is a challenge we all face in our work. So what are some tips for setting really clear goals and strategies and tactics in our work? So I think the number one thing is to really learn and understand the landscape that you're working within before you set your goals, right? So you might, as an organization, really want to push something forward, but it's critical to consider how ripe are the people in your network who are going to help you do this to engage in this work. Have you ever talked to them about this particular issue or subject matter before? Do you feel like they need education around this? What about policymakers if it's something that's policy related? Are you in a political environment right now where it's going to be really, really difficult to move that issue forward? That is not to say that you shelve those goals if the answer to those questions is yes, people need a lot more education, or yeah, it's a harsh political environment. But it could mean that, you have to either lengthen or extend your timeline for, when you want to pursue these things or how you expect it to unfold. Or maybe one of your goals is going to be in the first year, we just want to educate people on this. Or we want to build 4 or 5 champions at the legislature who care about this. Those are valuable goals, right? Secondary goals to achieving your ultimate goal of passage, right? So knowing that stuff really helps you to set those realistic goals. And then, another thing too that we focus a lot on in our work is targeting, which I know is a little bit of a trigger word, especially in the nonprofit space, because it kind of implies that lobbying piece, which obviously nonprofits can do, but in a limited scope. But targeting can mean a lot of different things. It's not just political targeting. It's understanding, right, where you have the greatest amount of resources, where you can leverage the most people based on where it's most politically advantageous for you, right? And then focusing on those places with a greater amount of intensity. And that is critical so that, you aren't, you're not trying to spread yourself too thin, and that you're maximizing resources in the places that make the most sense. The other thing, too, that is that you guys want to think about is prioritizing. So, oh, sorry, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. We'll just pause for a quick second.
I'd like to ask people if they're having trouble seeing the presentation on their screen, if they could just let us know in the chat box. We'll be back up in a minute. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for your patience. It would not be a webinar if there was not some technical difficulty. So appreciate it. So continuing on with tips for goal strategies, tactics. You know, another thing that's really critical is to prioritize what activities are going to be most impactful, right? So instead of picking, 10 different tactics that sound really great, focus on a few things that you think will most set you up for success and that will give you the biggest return on your investment, depending upon what it is that you're trying to achieve. And then, I think the other piece to this that's critical is not getting distracted by the bright and shiny tactics that, kind of sound really good and really like fun in theory, but, maybe have little impact overall. So for example, in our work, I've heard organizations say like, hey, I have $20,000 to do our grassroots engagement work. I think I'm going to do a billboard. Earned media, paid media, all of those things, for example, are really great, but they tend to be good complementary tactics to the stuff you're doing to warm the ground with real people. So it's not to say don't ever do a billboard, don't ever do paid media, but they should be complementary to the other stuff you are doing. So think really critically and hard about, and this stuff is difficult, about what is it that's really going to get you where you want to go. Maybe it is something that's really, bright, shiny, cool, sexy, but maybe it's not. You need to just ask yourself these questions. Sorry, guys, we're having another little issue here. There we go. Thank you. Okay, I think we're back on track here. So then the last thing I want to say about this is, another good tip is to leverage partners. So you guys do this work already, I'm sure, in various capacities, so this probably isn't new. If you're not the only organization who's doing work on this issue or who actually cares about this issue in some capacity, whatever it is that you're focused on, work with your partners. Really think about how do we do work that complements each other and doesn't duplicate. So for example, where is it that you have resources and assets? Where is it that they have resources and assets? How do we, taking our strategy and goals into account, how do we work together to make sure that we're moving this thing forward and adding, a greater power to this overall effort by joining together and joining forces? Okay. So let's talk then about, so we talked about goal, strategy, and tactics. Let's talk about how you then, take all of that and sort of, plan it out to get on the right track. So I don't know how many of you do planning. I'm sure all of you in various capacities. And, it's a pain in the butt. I'm not going to lie. I've done a ton of plans, both on behalf of organizations, but also within my own job, right? It's difficult because you're forced to really sit down and think about, okay, how is this going to actually happen? So it's not always the fun part of the job because you're really forced to challenge yourself, but it's critical because it helps to make sure that the goals, strategies, and tactics that you have laid out are actually realistic and attainable. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. It helps to create benchmarks for success, keep the work on track, and of course, create accountability. So what's the step that goes into a good plan? So one of the things is numbers. So we've talked about sort of the higher level, the strategic piece of really thinking about what are our goals, what's our vision, what do we want this to look like. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to build in ways to keep yourself accountable. So numbers, to some degree, is usually a part of that, right? So if your effort is to, mobilize people eventually to contact a decision maker, and again, I know that's kind of a simplistic example, but one I think we can all relate to, then you're going to have to figure out, okay, how many community members do we need to recruit? How many elected officials are we targeting, which will answer that former question, right? And then that'll help you figure out then when you're laying out a timeline, okay, how are we going to recruit these people? What methods are we going to do that? And then when do we need to do it by? Resources. So the number and type of staff that you have. So you might find, right, you've laid out these goals, strategies, and tactics, and then you're like, man, okay, we actually only have one staff or a part-time person that's dedicated to doing this work. What does that mean for us? Does that mean that we have to, get an intern that can help with this, a part-time organizer, somebody that we're, maybe 20 hours a week to help us get the work done? Or does it just mean that we're going to have to scale back a little bit and rethink what we're doing, right? So really assessing your resources staff-wise, and then also what other, kind of internal or external technology you have at your access, what other players are involved and who's kind of helping to move this forward. Just really taking a great, clear picture of what you have that's going to help you move this forward, and that helps you determine whether it's doable. Related to that, defining rules. So this is pretty straightforward, but it certainly trips people up. It's tripped me up before. Who is doing what? So the last thing you want is to be sitting around the table saying, oh my God, I thought you were setting up that meeting, or okay, I thought that you were doing that. Really being clear on who is doing what, setting up that accountability. We talked a little bit about timeline, but, working backwards from your goal, what has to be in place and when in order for it to happen. If it's not on the timeline, it's not going to happen. So it's really important to be clear on those things. And benchmarks. So how you're going to measure success along the way. So, for example, if you want to engage community members in conversations about getting a food shelf created, or that, you want to have X number of conversations with a decision maker this session, you might say, okay, we want 50% of conversations with those community members complete by X time, or we want 50% of those meetings with elected officials done before this bill gets to X committee or before conference committee or whatever it is. You want to think strategically about when is it going to be most advantageous for you to get this work done and to accomplish your goal. This one's is a little bit more nebulous, I think, to kind of talk about it. It's I guess like everything else, it is dependent on what your goals and strategies and tactics are. But I think this just degree of internal and, if applicable, external coordination is really key. So, for example, if you are working on a policy effort, making sure that you are in close collaboration with the people who are doing the communications work and the lobbying work and the grassroots work, so that all of those pieces are talking to each other, for lack of a better term. So if you don't have a lot of people in a district that is really important to you, is there a way that you can leverage grass top support? Is there a way that maybe then you can do a deeper communication strategy there, like getting earned media or, getting an editorial board to sign on to supporting your issue? So think about how all of these pieces work together is really, really critical. It's important that that work is not siloed. It's not just grassroots happening over here and then lobbying happening over there. The communications grassroots, the lobbying piece, they're all happening. They're kind of like the three legs of a stool, as it were. And then budget, budget, budget. So this isn't just about, knowing how much money you have to work with, as it says here. I mean, obviously, you guys know that that is important. But this can be used as a tool to figure out, okay, how do we, maybe get in-kind support? Or, okay, we can't afford to rent space, but, is there some place that's willing to let us have our event there? It helps you figure out how to prioritize where to spend your money or where you might want to look for additional resources based on what you currently have to work with. And, of course, where you think it's most important to spend dollars. Maybe it's most important to spend money on staffing. Maybe hey, we need bodies. We need people to hit the phone. We need people to coordinate this work, right? So you have to think about where is it most strategically advantageous for us to use these resources. So similar to the tips for, laying out strategies, tactics, goals, this again sounds all, I think in many ways pretty intuitive, right? Like this is stuff that we all do every day in many cases, but staying on track is really tricky because once you get started and you are in the thick of a campaign or you're in the thick of an initiative or moving something forward, there's a lot of stuff that happens and is thrown at you. Plus, people are busy, right? So it's easy for your attention to kind of get, focus on a number of different things. So it's really important when you lay out a plan to look at it as a living and breathing document that needs to be updated and adjusted throughout the effort. This is not a rule book, right? So you have to be nimble. As political, grassroots, and other circumstances change, your goals, strategies, and tactics may need adjustment, right? So if, for example, and this has happened actually with one of our clients, I remember the legislature completely shifted, when there was an election. It shifted when we were working on an issue. And so it was like, okay, well, our targets have changed. Our strategy has changed because the people who we have to influence now, feel differently about our issue than maybe they did before, and they are now in power. What does that mean for our plan? So you're going to have to be nimble, and you're going to have to rethink about, how to make it workable based on the realities as they currently stand. The third thing is, not being afraid to try new things. So if if a tactic isn't working, for example, there's usually a couple of different reasons for that, right? One, it could be that the challenge has just been in the execution. Like it's just there's a better way to maybe execute it than has been done. But the second thing is it might just not be working. So don't be afraid to say, like, look, I don't think this is getting us where we need to be. We need to try something else. Remember, there's a million different tactics out there that can help you achieve your strategies. So don't be afraid to try new stuff if it's not working. And then also, constantly ask yourself, will this activity help us to achieve our goal? I would say that this is probably, if you said, what's the number one thing you say in your job? What's the sentence that you repeat most frequently? It is this. To what end are we doing this? Be that person at the table if you're working with other staff, partners, coalition folks, that is saying, that sounds cool, that sounds interesting, but what is it going to do for us? Is it going to help us achieve our goal? If there is not a clear answer to that, if you can't answer it or the people at the table can't answer it, it's probably because it's not a good idea. So just because it sounds cool doesn't mean that it's effective. The last two things, so, redefining success. So a win can mean many different things. So going back to sort of the goals earlier where I mentioned that, your goal in this first year might just be about educating people, educating elected officials, educating the public about why something is important. That can be a win. Hey, we got 4 new champions this year. We didn't have that last year. And it's important to do that because I think most of us are so focused on the end result, like I certainly am too, right? Because we want to win. We want to achieve our objectives. We are being held accountable by funders and other people. But it is important to really state the case for building towards your goal and how the things that you are doing now are going to set you up for greater success in the long run. So that's important both for funders but also for your base and for the people that you're engaging to redefine those wins. Like, hey, we didn't get it this year, but here's what we did. Here's what we did that has positioned us for success down the road. Mm-hmm. Sure. And then lastly, and this might sound a little hokey, everyone, but I think it's really important to be easy on yourself. This stuff is really hard. If this were easy, I wouldn't have a job and we wouldn't exist as a firm. It is very difficult to plan and strategize in this way, in an ongoing way in the work you guys are doing where you have a million other responsibilities and stuff going on, and there's so much that's out of your control. So be easy on yourself, and this stuff is really difficult.
Thanks, Dana. This is Susie Brown again. Thank you all for being with us for Dana's formal presentation. We'll shift now to questions. I'll tee that up a little bit, but we really encourage you to type in your questions into the chat box. Before I start with a question for you, Dana, I just want to observe that, really what we heard this morning is a lot about basic planning that we should all be doing in lots of different parts of our organizational operations and programs applied to working with our public on grassroots issues. And you had described one of the pitfalls, or several pitfalls in the nonprofit sector related to this work. Another one of which I'd like to add, maybe is a common thread, is when we have a variety of stakeholders, the ones that you named, maybe clients or customers, donors, volunteers, who share our worldview on important issues, for example, on ending hunger. And maybe our gut instinct and the tool that's most available to us is to encourage those stakeholders to share their outrage publicly, as we do, or to share their concern publicly. And that's a great instinct, but not the same kind of tangible, goal-oriented plan that we hear from Dana. So we really have potential in the sector to be able to do more than help our stakeholders share their concerns or outreach, but actually turn that through planning into something that is goal-oriented, tangible, and can move us in maybe sometimes baby steps toward actually achieving specific wins in that area. So I'd like to just ask you, Dana, if you could illustrate something for us. You talked about we may have a starting point, which is we'd like to end hunger, and we need to turn that into what are our specific goals that are going to get us there, like maybe it's a food shelf, or maybe it's trying to protect SNAP at the federal level, or maybe it's something else. How might a hunger-oriented organization use their grassroots community and a plan to actually figure out which of the tangible things they should do first?
That's a really good question. So, I would say, one of the things that we do, and we actually have in the past worked with organizations on, like, just having a strategy session and doing goal setting around this very question. I think that I think it goes back to understanding the landscape and knowing, what issues you are in greatest position to move forward. I think, one of the things that is really important is to not think of it as just issue by issue by issue, but, first talking about the visionary. So in 5 years, what do we think we want the landscape to look like? What do we want to say that we've accomplished? And then work backwards from there. Okay, so what sorts of issues on the policy level or, engagement level will help us build towards that? And I think that helps to define those policy, those objectives. I do think then you have to ask yourself to kind of come full circle, is it realistic? Or so the question of like, well, which one to do first? I mean, that's when you really have to dig in the dirt of where is energy around this? So do we have other partners working on this issue? Are there things that there's been greater momentum around for whatever reason? So maybe it was introduced, a policy was introduced last year. It got, a little further. We want to try and move it again this year, and here's why. We think we've made some strides. We think we've built some champions. So I think you have to do that analysis internally of, what do we want to do in an ideal world, but then what is realistic? And, some of that includes, I think, having conversations with decision makers, feeling out your network and your, base, and then talking to some of your partners and seeing where their energy is at too. I don't know if that is a good answer off the cuff, I feel, but But
that's great. And maybe people who are listening have some specific ideas of things that you might do with your stakeholders. You could hold a community meeting. You could hold a teleconference. You could do a survey. There are a variety of ways that you can get information from those who are in your stakeholder group to engage them in this very conversation. We're looking at a question that's come in.
It's a good question.
Okay.
Should we read it out loud?
Sure. So on trying, says Kelsey out there, thank you, Kelsey, on trying new things, what advice would you offer to a staffer in an organization where this is the way we've always done things mentality reigns?
Oh, Kelsey, this is such a great question. Well, I think that I think it depends who the person is. So, not to get too in the weeds, but like if it's your boss, that is maybe a slightly different approach than if it is an organizer that you are overseeing, right? Or like somebody who's at a peer level. I think, gosh, such a good question. So, the way that I think, the diplomatic way to approach it and the way that I personally would approach it and the way that we've approached it with organizations is to say, look, it seems like this is kind of where we're headed. This is where we're interested in going. These are the kinds of things that we've done in the past. Here's the stuff that's been really, really successful. This is the stuff that seems to really work for us. But there's a few things that maybe haven't worked as much, and here's why. And then I think it's helpful to come to the table, if possible, with a couple of suggestions and say, like, look, it doesn't hurt to try something new. It doesn't hurt to, give it a whirl. And if it doesn't work, we can revisit this other way of doing things. But I think that's probably the best approach. I think, we're talking about personality dynamics here too. Like, let's be honest, like that's embedded in this question, and we've all experienced that. So, you might know best how this person would receive, the information. But that's what I would do. That's what I would try.
And this is Susie Brown again. I have a couple additional thoughts on this topic. One is that advocacy work is rarely done alone. This is an area of great potential for nonprofit collaboration and partnerships. And one of the ways we might, in our individual organizations, address the question of this is how we've always done things, is to really point to and build a relationship with organizations that are doing things differently toward the same goal. So if organization X, where you are employed, and organization Y have in common their desire to end hunger, and your organization addresses it one way and the other organization addresses it another, it's a great opportunity to ask yourself the question or ask them, what are the strategies here that we can work together on, or how can we learn from another organization? A second piece that I'll add to this is it's really a legitimate issue that organizations do things in certain ways, and changing them is no small thing. And it requires careful thought and strategy, and sometimes it requires a conversation at the board level. So sometimes tactics like building grassroots strategies and engaging your stakeholders in new and different ways is something that is worthy of a governance discussion and worthy of really setting the organization on a new path from the highest governance level. We'll talk about some of that at our next month's webinar, so please tune in for that if you're interested.
There's also one last thing that Susie got me thinking about this, and I recognize this may not be good advice for everybody, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think there's something to be said sometimes about asking for forgiveness later. So, if you're in a position to maybe try something new, do a little pilot on something, and then come back and show that, there's a little bit of traction or people are excited about it, there's some energy about it, that could be a good thing. I'm just saying. So that could be another option.
We had a question come in from Tom asking if this information is available in printed form. We'll be sending an email out to all registrants after this meeting with a link to a copy of the slideshow and also a link to a recording of this webinar.
And this is Susie Brown again. I'm going to ask another question of Dana, and if people out there in webinar land have additional questions for Dana, please send them in now as we're getting toward the end of our time. But Dana, in the beginning when you presented us with some definitions, you talked about organizing and mobilizing, and you mentioned that essentially the best mobilizing occurs when the organizing has already happened. Could you please just expand on those concepts for us a little bit, in case there are people who are unfamiliar with those terms or really want to get a basic delineation between what's the difference between organizing and mobilizing?
I love this question because it comes up so often in our work, and I think organizing and mobilizing is a really important distinction for organizations. So I'll repeat myself a little bit from what I said before, that, when we think of organizing, it's really about building that power that you need, getting people engaged, recruiting them, educating them, and then mobilizing is sort of how you harness that power over time. So the reason that distinction is important is because a lot of times, and this isn't a nonprofit thing, this is anybody who does any kind of organizing thing, they conflate those two. So they think they're asking their people to do, so here's what happens a lot, I'll put it this way. During session, people are asked to do something, then they're not talked to again for 6 or 7 months. And what happens is that people go away, they forget about your issue because they're busy. They have stuff going on. So organizing is about, what do we do during those times where there's not a lot of action to educate people, keep them informed of what's going to be coming up next. So first of all, what happened this last session? What's going to be coming up, maybe next year? How do you need their help? Are there volunteer thank you events you could do? And I don't mean something like a road show across the state. I mean, can you have a party, invite your volunteers, thank them, recognize them, and then keep them updated throughout the summer? Are there ways that you can engage your base to recruit even more people? If that's something that, again, if your goal is to build your network, how do you do that during periods when there isn't a lot of action? We often think of our volunteers as people who are there to just do stuff that we want them to do, like a very transactional sort of approach, like I email you, you do something that I ask you to do. But the most successful organizations who do this work understand that it's a relationship they're building, and that's what that organizing is about. It's building that relationship, having that two-way communication. And then organizations who do that well find that then when it's time to mobilize and activate people, they're more likely to say yes. They're more likely to want to help the organization achieve their objectives because they are something that's really important to them too. They feel really bought in to the outcome. Does that answer the question, Susie?
It does. So good mobilizing follows good organizing.
Yes.
And just to be really clear on the benefits of the good organizing, because it is an awful lot of effort that you can put into things that don't maybe feel like they have immediate tangible results. Maybe we could just review 3 or 4 of the key benefits of this kind of ongoing organizing. One, obviously, is a strengthened relationship. So when you need to activate that relationship, there's something there that you see and they see. A second that I heard you say is that people are really informed in a bigger way than just the moment that you need them, but they're really informed about the issue and understand kind of where it is in an ongoing way. And then I'm assuming also that an additional benefit is that people feel a part of something. And when you feel a part of something, when that something is activating or doing something or moving, you want to be on that team and you want to be with it. So those seem to be some of the things that I heard you say. Are there any other things that you'd like to add about how, if we're thinking about this year-long, year-round work when it's not the exciting moments, what are the benefits you're building? Anything else to add there?
The only thing I would say, and this is less about a benefit and more about an approach, is that, if you can provide a personal touch at any point, that's beneficial, right? So a lot of times we communicate with people via email. We communicate with our base via email. But if there's one point during the summer or in the fall that you can have a couple of volunteers or an intern call through the list of people in your network and just say, hey, really want to talk to you a little bit about what we're up to. Hear what you think. Find out if you're willing to do more. That personal touch makes a huge difference because people are inundated with emails. They're getting tons of emails all the time. I don't open half the emails that come to my Gmail account, to be perfectly honest. So it's that personal touch that I think can really make a difference too. And I also think that it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to take up all of your time and resources. Think about a couple of things that you can do that are a little bit more personal than your general email and do them over the course of a year.
Great. Thanks. We're close to the end of our time, and there aren't any questions in the queue, so I think we will bring this to a close. I have a few closing comments. If you do as well, Dana, you're welcome. But most of all, we'd really like to thank everyone for joining and make sure that you see the last slide, which invites you to be in touch with Dana if you have additional questions. Grassroots Solutions is a terrific resource in Minnesota, and Dana is available for assistance if you have follow-up questions after this webinar. And certainly the policy staff, myself included, at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits would be happy to work with you, your organizational leadership, or your movement on these kinds of issues. If you are interested in sharing this topic that we discussed today with others or viewing it again, as Mark mentioned earlier, this will be available on our YouTube site through our website at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. And as I mentioned before in response to Kelsey's question, the next training of this sort in September will be about working with your board to develop a policy plan. And in some cases, as we discussed today, you'll find that developing a policy plan or taking a new strategy or tactic in the area of policy really is important to be a board-level discussion. So we are looking forward to discussing that in the webinar next month. It will be September 25th at 10 a.m. Mark and I will be here again, and we will be joined by Amy Brew, who is a former policy director at a local nonprofit here in Minnesota and a member of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits Board of Directors. We hope you'll join us then, and we thank you for participating in today's webinar.